No man wants a woman who reads more than she smiles, Aunt Ruth said, loud enough for half the mercantile to hear. Clara Whitfield didn't look up from the ledger she was balancing behind the counter. Her pencil kept moving, columns of numbers falling into neat rows, because numbers didn't lie to her the way people did. Outside, the wind combed dust down the length of Miller's Gap, and somewhere a loose shutter banged against a wall like something knocking to be let in. "I heard she turned down the Preston boy again," said Mrs. Dunlap, not bothering to lower her voice either. "Third time. A girl can't afford to be choosy when she's built like a fence post and twice as plain." Clara's pencil paused for half a second. Then it kept going. She had grown used to this, the town's casual cruelty, delivered over bolts of calico and tins of tobacco like it was nothing more than the weather. 26 years old, unmarried, running her father's store since his hands had gone too shaky to count coin. She had stopped expecting kindness from Miller's Gap a long time ago. She had not, however, stopped noticing things. That was the one gift nobody could take from her. She noticed everything, which was how she noticed the stranger the moment he came through the door. He didn't announce himself. He simply stepped out of the white afternoon glare into the shadowed store, and the bell above the door gave one thin, startled ring before going quiet, as if it too had thought better of drawing attention to him. He was tall in that quiet way that didn't need to prove itself, dust ground into the creases of a coat that had seen better winters, and a hat pulled low enough that his eyes were the last thing you saw, which meant they were the first thing you remembered. Gray, steady. The kind of eyes that had watched a great deal and said nothing about most of it. He carried a canvas sack that clinked faintly with tools, and beneath his left sleeve, just above the wrist, she caught the edge of a bandage gone brown at the center. "Ma'am." His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that silence cost less than talking. "I need salt, coffee, and whatever thread you've got that'll hold a stitch in leather." Aunt Ruth's mouth had already fallen half open, ready to ask him his business, his name, his intentions. Miller's Gap collected strangers' stories the way other towns collected rain. But the man's gaze had drifted, just briefly, to Clara's hands, still resting on the ledger, ink-stained at the first knuckle. "You keep good books," he said. "Not a question." "I keep honest ones," Clara answered. "There's a difference in this town." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. "I expect there is." She fetched his goods without being asked twice, weighing the coffee with a practiced hand, measuring the thread by feel rather than by the yardstick nailed to the counter. When she reached for the salt, her sleeve rode up, and she saw him notice the burn scar along her forearm, the one she'd gotten 3 winters back, pulling her father from a grease fire he'd started forgetting the stove was lit. Most men looked away from a mark like that, or worse, asked about it like it was public property. He only looked at it the way he'd looked at her ledger, like it was information, like it mattered. "That bandage needs changing," she said, nodding at his wrist. "Doc Halloran's 2 doors down if you're needing him." "Rather not trouble a doctor with a scratch," the stranger said. "Scratches don't turn a bandage that color." For the first time he actually smiled, small, involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. "You always argue with customers, Miss Whitfield. And only the ones who lie to me." Noted, Miss Whitfield. He set his coins on the counter, careful and exact, the same number of coins as the price, not a cent more offered as tribute to conversation. "Name's Cole Bishop. I'll be around the Gap a spell. Doing some work out at the old Harlan spread." The Harlan spread. Clara's stomach dropped a half-inch, though she kept her face as still as the ledger paper. Nobody worked the Harlan spread. Nobody had, not since old Silas Harlan had been found dead in his own well 2 summers past. And the land had sat there since, cursed by rumor if nothing else, waiting for a fool or a desperate man to claim it. "That land's not for sale," she said carefully. "Last I heard. Didn't say I was buying it." Cole Bishop settled his hat lower, gathering his purchases into the crook of one arm. "Said I was working it. There's a difference in this town." He repeated her own words back to her, and there was nothing mocking in it, only the quiet acknowledgement of an equal. "Afternoon, Miss Whitfield." The bell rang once more as he left, and the store seemed to exhale around his absence. Well, Aunt Ruth said, fanning herself with a length of ribbon, scandalized and delighted in equal measure. Well, I never. But Clara was already moving to the window, watching the tall shape of him cross the street toward the livery, unhurried, careful, a man walking like he expected trouble to come from any direction and had made his peace with that a long time ago. She noted the way his right hand never strayed far from his hip. She noted the fresh horseshoe nails scattered in the dust of his boot prints. New shoes, recently set, a man expecting a hard ride soon. She noted, most of all, that in the entire conversation, Cole Bishop had never once called her plain, or asked why a woman her age wasn't married, or looked at her like she was a problem in need of solving. He had simply looked at her like she was a person. That night, lying awake above the store while her father coughed in the next room, Clara found herself turning over a single unwelcome thought. A man who worked cursed land and bled through his bandages and carried himself like every shadow might hold a gun was not a man who came to Miller's Gap for a fresh start. He was a man running from something, and whatever it was, she had a feeling it was only a matter of time before it came looking for him. 3 days later, Clara found him collapsed against the well outside the Harlan barn, the bandage on his wrist soaked through entirely, his face gone the color of old tallow. She had come out on the pretext of delivering flour he hadn't ordered, a lie she told herself was practical, since the Harlan place was on her route to the Kessler farm anyway. Never mind that it wasn't. Never mind that she'd added 4 miles to her afternoon for no reason she wanted to examine too closely. She found him with his shirt torn open at the shoulder, and beneath the old wrist wound, a second one. A bullet grazed along his ribs, days old, gone an angry red at the edges. "You've got infection setting in," she said, kneeling in the dust without waiting for permission, already reaching for her satchel. She always carried carbolic and clean linen. Her father's shaking hands had taught her that much. This needed a doctor a week ago. Doctors ask questions. Cole's voice was thin, stripped of its earlier steadiness. Questions get back to the wrong ears. And bleeding to death in a dead man's barn doesn't strike you as worse? He almost laughed, though it cost him. Didn't figure on company. "You've got it anyway." She cut away the ruined bandage with her sewing scissors, hands steady even as her heart was not. The wound beneath was ugly, not fresh enough to be an accident, old enough to have started healing wrong before something tore it back open. A knife, maybe, or a rope pulled too fast through skin. "Who did this to you, Mr. Bishop?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Man named Garrett Voss. Runs cattle 2 counties over, or he did, till I found out he was running something else under the cattle, stolen stock, army rifles, men who disappeared owing him money. I worked for him 8 months before I understood what I was really moving. When I tried to leave, he decided I knew too much to walk away clean." Clara's hands didn't stop moving, but something in her chest went very still. "So you ran?" "I ran," Cole agreed. "Same as I've been running 11 months. Figured a dead man's cursed land was as good a place as any to stop and mend a while. Nobody wants to come near the Harlan place. Even Voss's men. Except that's not true anymore, is it?" Clara said quietly, pressing a clean cloth hard against the wound until he hissed. "Because a wound like this doesn't come from 11 months ago. This is new." His silence was answer enough. "They found you," she said, 3 days back. 2 riders, scouting the ridge line east of here. I don't think they know which spread I'm working yet. But Voss doesn't stop looking. Never has, for any man who left him." Clara sat back on her heels, studying him. The gray eyes gone dull with fever and fatigue. The jaw clenched hard against pain he refused to name aloud. The careful stillness of a man who had learned that panic got people killed. She thought of every warning her whole life had taught her. Don't trust strangers, don't harbor trouble. A plain woman with no husband to protect her reputation could not afford scandal, could not afford danger, could not afford a man with riders on his trail and a price on his silence. She thought of all of that, and then she reached for her needle and thread anyway. "Hold still," she said. "This is going to need stitches, and I've only got the leather thread you bought off me 3 days back. So I hope you don't mind matching your insides to your saddle." Something in his exhausted face cracked open into real surprise. "You're not going to send for the sheriff?" "Sheriff Dunlap drinks with half the ranchers in this county and gossips with the other half. I send for him, You'll have Voss's men here by sundown courtesy of somebody's loose tongue. She threaded the needle with hands that did not shake, though everything in her was shaking. I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Bishop. I'm doing this because a man dying in a barn on Harlan land is bad for property values, and I have to live in this town. It was a lie, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. He held still while she worked, jaw tight, sweat beading along his hairline, and when she finally tied off the last stitch he let out a breath like he'd been holding it for 11 months. Why, he said, "Lo, would a woman who doesn't know me risk what you're risking?" Clara wound the last of the linen around his ribs, refusing to meet his eyes, because she wasn't entirely sure of the answer herself. Because everyone in this town has already decided who I am and what I'm worth, Mr. Bishop. Nobody's ever once asked me what I might decide for myself. She sat back, wiping her hands on her apron. Maybe I'm tired of only being brave inside a ledger book. Word of a stranger camped on the Harlan place had already begun to move through Miller's Gap by the time she rode home that evening. She could feel it in the way Mrs. Dunlap watched her pass the mercantile window, in the way Aunt Ruth's questions grew sharper at supper. Suspicion was a current in a small town, and it moved faster than any rider. By week's end, riders were seen on the eastern ridge 2 more times. By the second week, someone had started asking, in low voices around the church steps, whether Clara Whitfield had lost what little sense she had, riding out alone to a dead man's land. Clara heard every word of it. And every evening, she packed clean linen and a jar of broth into her saddlebag anyway, and rode out to the Harlan place regardless, because somewhere in the 11 days since she'd threaded that needle, she had stopped being able to unmake her decision, even if she'd wanted to, which she found, disturbingly, that she did not. The night everything changed. The wind carried the smell of smoke before it carried the sound of hoofbeats. Clara smelled it first from her bedroom window. Not the clean smoke of a hearth fire, but the wrong smoke, oil-thick and urgent, drifting from the direction of the Harlan spread. She was pulling her boots on before she'd fully decided to, some animal certainty in her chest already knowing exactly whose fire this was. She reached the ridge above the Harlan barn just as 3 riders wheeled their horses away from a blaze eating up the old hay stores, torches still smoking in 2 of their hands. Cole was on the ground near the well, favoring the leg they'd apparently caught with a rope before he'd broken free of it, a revolver in his good hand and blood already darkening his shirt from a fresh graze along his temple. Bishop, the lead rider's voice carried easy across the yard. A big man with a beard the color of rust and a voice that had the false warmth of a man used to being obeyed. Garrett Voss. Could be no one else. You made this harder than it needed to be, running off like a scared dog. Voss, don't forget a debt. And you owe more than money. I don't owe you anything but the truth of what you are. Cole called back. And I already told the army recruiter passing through Cheyenne everything I know. It was a lie. Clara could hear it was a lie. The same way she'd known the lie of property values she told herself 11 days before, but it landed exactly as Cole intended, because Voss's face went through a violent, ugly shift, fear masquerading instantly as rage. Burn the rest, Voss snarled to his men, and that was when Clara made a choice with no time left to weigh it. She spurred her horse down the slope, shouting the loudest, most reckless thing she could think of. "Sheriff's already riding. Half the men in this county saw your smoke from the church tower." It was, of course, another lie. But 3 riders with stolen rifles and army contraband weighing on their consciences did not stay to verify anything. Voss's gaze snapped to her, calculating, furious, and for one endless second Clara thought he might simply shoot her from the saddle and be done with witnesses altogether. Instead, he spat into the dirt. "This ain't finished, Bishop," he called, already turning his horse. "You or the woman. Don't matter to me which." The 3 riders vanished into the dark the way trouble always did in this country. Fast, and leaving worse behind than it took. Clara was off her horse and at Cole's side before the hoofbeats had fully faded. Hands pressed hard against the wound at his temple. Her voice shaking now that there was finally time for it to. "You could have been killed. You could have. So could you." His good hand closed around her wrist. Not to stop her tending him but simply to hold on. The way a man holds something to prove to himself it's real. "You shouldn't have come, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I heard you were burning," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke. What was I going to do? Stay home and mind my ledgers? The barn behind them collapsed inward with a groan of timber and a great gasp of orange sparks lifting into the dark. And for a moment neither of them moved, watching 11 months of Cole's careful, hard-won hiding burn down to embers in front of them. "He'll come back," Cole said quietly, once the worst of the roar had died to crackling. "Not tonight. But he doesn't stop, Clara. He never has. And now he knows about you. Then we don't wait for him to decide when," Clara said, surprising herself with how steady the words came out. "We decide." Cole looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, something in his gray eyes shifting. Not quite disbelief, not quite gratitude. Something closer to the particular ache of a man who has spent 11 months learning to expect nothing from the world and has just been handed something anyway. "You don't know what you're offering," he said. "Helping a man like Voss Hunts, that's not a debt you walk away from easy. I've spent my whole life being told what I'm too plain, too old, too stubborn to be offered," Clara said. "I think I'm allowed to decide, for once, what I'm willing to risk." Somewhere behind them, the last wall of the barn folded into the fire with a sound like a great door closing. Ahead of them lay only the dark ridge line, and beyond it, somewhere, 3 riders carrying word back to a man who did not forgive debts. They spent that night in the toolshed behind the Harlan house. The one building the fire hadn't reached, Clara tending Cole's wounds by lantern light while the smell of smoke still clung to both their clothes. "You're better at this than Doc Halloran," Cole said, wincing as she cleaned the graze at his temple. "Where'd a shopkeeper's daughter learn to stitch a man back together? My mother died when I was 12. My father's hands started shaking not long after, from the grief of it, I think, though he'd never say so plain." Clara worked with careful, practiced hands, not looking up. "Somebody had to learn to hold a needle steady in this family. Turned out to be me. That why you never married? Too busy holding everyone else together to let somebody hold you?" The question could have stung, coming from most men. From Cole it simply sat between them, honest, unhurried, the same way he asked everything. "I turned down 3 offers," Clara admitted. Preston wanted a housekeeper who wouldn't argue with him. Weathers wanted a pretty wife to show off at church. And I've been told often enough I don't qualify. And Judge Marsh's nephew wanted somebody to manage his accounts for free instead of paying a clerk. She tied off the bandage, finally meeting his eyes. "I decided a bad bargain is still a bad bargain, even lonely. That why you helped me? Some kind of bargain?" "No." The word came out quieter than she intended. "You're the first person in this town who's ever asked me a question because you wanted to know the answer, and not because you were building a case for what to think of me." Cole reached into his coat with his good hand and drew out a small object, worn smooth with handling. A carved wooden bird, no bigger than a thumb, its wings folded close to its body. "My sister carved this," he said, turning it over in his palm before offering it to her. "Before the fever took her 11 years back. Kept it through the war, through every fool thing I've done since. It's the only thing I've never sold, even when I was hungry enough to consider it." Clara took the bird carefully, feeling the worn grooves of its wings beneath her fingers, the small weight of 11 years of a stranger's grief resting in her palm. "Why give it to me? Because you stitched a debt runner back together in a dead man's barn without asking what was in it for you," Cole said, "and because I've been 11 months learning that the people worth trusting are the ones who never once made you feel like a burden for needing help. You didn't. Not once." Outside, the last embers of the barn ticked and settled in the dark, and somewhere an owl called once and went quiet. Clara closed her fingers around the little wooden bird, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since she was 12 years old and learning to hold a needle steady for a whole grieving household. "Scars mean it lived," she said softly, more to herself than to him, an old thing her mother used to say about the burn marks on well-used cookware, about torn hems mended twice over, about anything that had been broken and made whole again rather than thrown away. "I always thought that was about pots and pans. Maybe it's about people too." Cole's hand found hers in the lantern light, careful, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. "Voss won't stop looking," he said low. "You understand that. Whatever this is, between us, it comes with a cost I already know the shape of. I've watched it collect from better people than me. I've spent my whole life being told what's too costly for a woman like me to want, Clara said. I'd rather choose my own cost, for once, than have this town keep choosing it for me. His thumb traced once, gently, over the burn scar on her forearm, the mark most men looked away from, the mark he had never once flinched at. Then we don't run, he said quietly. Not this time. We finish it here on my terms, before he brings more men than we can outlast. Outside, dawn was still hours off, but already Clara could feel the shape of what was coming. One final reckoning, arriving not with the slow dread of rumor but with the fast, certain violence of a man who never let a debt go unpaid. She closed the wooden bird in her fist and did not let go. Gerrit Voss returned 4 days later at noon with 6 riders instead of 3, enough men, he clearly believed, to end the matter without further argument. He hadn't counted on the whole of Miller's Gap standing in the street to meet him. It hadn't been Clara's plan alone. She'd spent those 4 days doing the one thing she'd always been good at and the town had always underestimated. She'd told the truth, plainly, to anyone who'd listen. Doc Halloran, the blacksmith, the Kessler family, even Mrs. Dunlap, who'd gone pale and then furious to learn what kind of men had been riding her county roads under cover of cattle business. A town that gossiped about a plain woman's choices could, it turned out, be roused just as easily by the truth of stolen army rifles and men made to disappear over unpaid debts. Sheriff Dunlap, shamed into action by his own wife, had wired the territorial marshal 2 days prior. But the marshal was 2 days out still, and Voss had never been a patient man. Bishop, Voss's voice rolled down the street, confident, carrying. 6 of us. 1 of you. I'll even let the woman walk if you come easy. I don't come easy, Cole called back, standing in the open street with his revolver holstered but his hand resting near it. And neither does the truth you've been running from for 11 months. Every rancher in this county's heard by now what you've been moving under your cattle drives. Every one of them's decided which side of this they stand on. It was true. Behind Cole and beside Clara stood a line of townsfolk that would have seemed impossible 11 days earlier. Doc Halloran with an old army rifle he hadn't fired since the war, the blacksmith with a heavy hammer resting easy against his shoulder, even Aunt Ruth, arms crossed, glaring at Voss like he owed her a debt on layaway. You'd risk your whole town over one runaway hand? Voss sneered, though something in his confidence had already begun to crack at the edges, counting faces, recalculating odds he hadn't planned for. We'd risk it over what's right, Clara said, stepping forward before she could think better of it, the little wooden bird tucked safe in her apron pocket. You burned a man's shelter and dragged him behind a rope for wanting no more part in your crimes. This town's decided that's not a debt you get to collect. For one long, taut moment, nobody moved. Voss's hand hovered near his own holster, weighing 6 armed men against a street full of townsfolk who'd stopped being afraid of him sometime in the last 4 days without quite realizing it themselves. It was the sound of a distant bugle, the marshal's escort, arriving a full day early, riding hard on rumor of trouble, that finally broke the standoff. Voss's men scattered before the badge even came into view, unwilling to trade a runaway debt for a federal noose, and Voss himself was left alone in the street, his bravado collapsing all at once into the small, cornered thing it had always been underneath. He didn't fight the marshal's men when they took him. There was, in the end, no reckoning grander than that. No gunfight, no blood spilled in the dust, only a bad man finally run out of road, and a town that had chosen, together, not to look away. Spring came to Miller's Gap the way it always did, slow. Then all at once, the frozen creek breaking loose in a single loud crack that echoed clear to the mercantile. Clara stood behind the counter that morning, balancing the ledger as she always had, though now there was a second set of boots by the door that hadn't been there the autumn before, and a small carved wooden bird sitting on the shelf behind the register where every customer who came through could see it, if they thought to ask. Most didn't ask. But Aunt Ruth had, eventually, and had gone quiet and thoughtful in a way that suited her better than gossip ever had. Cole had rebuilt the Harlan barn with his own hands through the winter, the whole town pitching in board by board once they'd decided the man who'd stood in the street against 6 riders had earned the right to stop running. He still carried the scar at his ribs, and the fresh one at his temple, and neither of them had ever once made him look away from her burn-marked arm. You ever regret it? He asked her one evening, watching her close out the ledger by lamplight, the way he often did now, no longer a stranger passing through but a fixture of the evening, the same as the lamp itself. Stitching up a runaway with a price on his head? I regret every year before it, Clara said, spent believing this town's opinion of me was the only opinion that mattered. She closed the ledger, its columns balanced clean, and reached for his hand the way she'd once reached for a needle. Steady, certain, unafraid of what the mending might cost. I don't regret a single thing since. Years later, the children of Miller's Gap would grow up hearing the story secondhand, embellished the way all good stories are. The plain shopkeeper's daughter and the mysterious cowboy who'd stood together in the street against 6 armed men. Some versions had the gunfight bloodier than it was. Some had Clara braver than even she remembered being. But every version agreed on the ending, because it was the only part nobody ever bothered to change. That the 2 names carved into the new beam of the rebuilt Harlan barn, Cole Clara, spring of that year, were still there, weathered but legible, long after everyone who doubted her had forgotten why they ever had.